The old man's hand never shook until the moment he reached across the polished oak table and placed a weathered brass key into Caleb Brooks' palm. Around them, half a dozen attorneys froze, 3 relatives exchanged bewildered looks, and a nurse standing quietly near the window stopped writing altogether. Caleb didn't close his fingers around the key. Instead, he gently pushed it back across the table. "Sir," he said softly, "your family is here." The old man looked past every expensive suit surrounding his bed and slid the key back toward Caleb without another word. Silence settled over the room with a weight no one seemed willing to disturb. Then a sharp voice finally broke it. "Absolutely not." Grant Whitmore stepped forward so quickly his chair scraped across the hardwood floor. "He cleans broken display cases for a living. He rents a 1-bedroom apartment. He owns practically nothing." His laugh was short and humorless. "You're telling us this is the man you trust?" Nobody answered. Caleb kept his eyes on Richard Whitmore instead of the accusations filling the room. He noticed the older man's breathing had become shallower over the past few minutes. He noticed the untouched glass of water beside the bed. Without saying a word, Caleb reached over, adjusted the straw, and moved the glass within easier reach before stepping back again. It was such a small gesture that most people barely noticed it. Richard did. His tired eyes softened for the first time that afternoon. The attorney cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitmore, if this reflects your final instruction, I need you to confirm it verbally." Before the old man could answer, another relative leaned forward. "He's manipulating you." Someone else muttered that grief had clouded Richard's judgment. Another quietly questioned Caleb's intentions. Through it all, Caleb never defended himself. He didn't mention the countless afternoons he'd spent repairing loose fence boards without charging a dime. He didn't mention the evenings he'd driven 30 miles after work simply because Richard had forgotten his medication in town. He didn't remind anyone that every favor had been done long before lawyers, hospitals, or inheritances entered the picture. Instead, he simply waited. Richard slowly lifted his gaze toward each face gathered around him, lingering only a second before returning to Caleb. There was gratitude there, but something else as well: urgency. Then Richard spoke just 7 words, each one deliberate despite the weakness in his voice. "Some promises cannot be left to family." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Questions erupted immediately. What promise? When had it been made? Why Caleb? Why not blood relatives? Even the attorney lowered his pen, clearly reconsidering everything he thought he understood about the afternoon. Richard reached for a sealed envelope resting beneath his blanket, but before his fingers could touch it, the cardiac monitor chimed softly, and the attending physician stepped forward, asking everyone to clear the room at once. As nurses guided the family toward the hallway, Caleb glanced back one last time. Richard wasn't looking at his relatives. He wasn't looking at the attorney. He was looking only at the unopened envelope, and silently urging Caleb not to let anyone else reach it first. The hallway outside Richard Whitmore's room filled with whispers almost as quickly as the family had been asked to leave. Nobody spoke to Caleb directly. They simply looked at him the way strangers look at someone who has accidentally wandered into the wrong building. Grant folded his arms without taking his eyes off him. "You should leave before you embarrass yourself any further," he said quietly enough that only Caleb could hear. Caleb answered with nothing more than a polite nod and stepped toward the waiting area instead of the elevator. He did not sit. He noticed an elderly volunteer struggling to stack folded blankets onto a cart and crossed the room to help without being asked. When she thanked him, he smiled gently and returned to standing outside Richard's door as though he had nowhere else he needed to be. An hour passed, then another. Nobody from the Whitmore family remained except Grant, who spent most of the afternoon pacing while arguing into his phone about court filings, trustees, and deadlines. Caleb heard every anxious word but pretended not to. Late that evening, the attending physician finally emerged with tired eyes and informed everyone that Richard had stabilized for the night but could receive only one visitor for 5 minutes. Grant stepped forward immediately. "I am family." Before the physician could answer, a weak voice drifted from inside the room. "Caleb." The doctor hesitated, glanced toward the doorway, then motioned for Caleb to enter. Grant's expression hardened, but hospital policy left no room for argument. Inside, the room felt smaller than before. Richard seemed exhausted, yet strangely peaceful. He pointed toward the chair instead of speaking. Caleb remained standing. You should save your strength, he said. Richard gave the faintest shake of his head and slowly reached beneath his blanket again. This time he managed to pull out the same sealed envelope everyone had noticed earlier. Across the front, written in careful blue ink, were only 5 words. Open only after my passing. Caleb instinctively stepped back. This belongs with your attorney. Richard closed his eyes for a long moment before answering. No, it belongs with the person who never asked for anything. Those words lingered between them. Caleb remembered the first afternoon they had met nearly 3 years earlier, when a broken museum delivery truck had stalled beside the old Whitmore farm. Richard had offered iced tea while Caleb repaired the engine himself instead of waiting 3 hours for roadside assistance. He had refused payment, saying kindness was easier to carry than cash. Somehow that single afternoon had turned into weekend fence repairs, conversations over coffee, and quiet friendship built without either man planning it. Richard's breathing slowed again. There is someone, he whispered before another coughing spell interrupted him. He reached toward the bedside drawer instead, searching with unsteady fingers until Caleb gently opened it for him. Inside lay a faded photograph of a smiling teenage girl standing beside a chestnut horse. Caleb recognized her immediately. Naomi. Richard pressed the photograph into Caleb's hand, then looked toward the unopened envelope resting beside it. If she learns the truth too soon, he murmured, his voice almost disappearing beneath the steady rhythm of the monitor. They will take everything from her. Before Caleb could ask who they were, the room's telephone rang sharply. Richard closed his eyes without answering, but the nurse who hurried in after the second ring looked unusually concerned. She turned toward Caleb and quietly said, "There is someone downstairs insisting they have legal authority to remove Miss Naomi from the property tonight." The call from downstairs changed everything before Caleb could even ask another question. The nurse looked at the name on the visitor request form, then back at him with an expression that made him realize this was not just another family disagreement. "They are asking for Naomi Whitmore," she said. "They claim they have temporary guardianship papers." Caleb looked through the glass wall toward Richard's bed. The older man was awake now, watching him carefully. For a moment, Caleb saw fear in the eyes of a man who had faced countless difficult decisions but had never looked afraid until someone mentioned losing his daughter. "Do not let them take her tonight," Richard whispered. It was not a demand. It was a promise being placed into Caleb's hands. Caleb looked down at the envelope, then at the photograph of Naomi beside the chestnut horse. He knew exactly what refusing to get involved would cost him. He could walk away. He could tell himself this was a family matter, that he had no legal authority, no money, and no reason to stand between powerful people and their lawyers. But he also knew something else. A 14-year-old girl who had already lost one parent should not have to face a room full of strangers alone. 10 minutes later, Caleb was standing in the hospital lobby beside Naomi. She had arrived quietly with a backpack over one shoulder and confusion written across her face. She looked nothing like the spoiled heir Grant had described. Her fingers kept touching the worn zipper of her backpack, the same way someone touches something familiar when everything else feels uncertain. "Are you Caleb?" she asked. He nodded. "My father talks about you." That surprised him. "He does." Naomi looked down. "He says you are the only person who helps without needing anyone to notice." Before Caleb could respond, 2 attorneys approached with documents in hand. They spoke calmly, professionally, and politely. That almost made it harder. They were not angry. They were confident. They explained that Naomi needed to leave with approved guardians until the estate matters were reviewed. Caleb listened carefully, then asked one question. Did Naomi agree to this? The attorneys exchanged a glance. It was only a second, but Naomi noticed it. So did Caleb. The moment created a new question. If everything was legal, why did nobody answer a simple question from the person most affected? The hospital security officer nearby watched the interaction closely. He had seen countless arguments in the lobby, but something about Caleb was different. The man had no expensive lawyer, no authority badge, and no influence. Yet he stood there calmly, while everyone else rushed to control the situation. The officer quietly asked another nurse, "Who is that man?" The nurse answered, "I do not know, but Mr. Whitmore trusts him." Later that evening, Caleb made a choice that surprised everyone. He refused to sign a temporary caretaker agreement that would give him access to Richard's estate or any financial benefit. The attorneys had included protections that could have helped him, but Caleb pushed the papers back across the table. If helping her comes with a reward, he said, then it was never really help. The room went silent. Naomi stared at him differently after that. Not because he promised to save her, because he proved he had no interest in taking anything from her. But as Caleb prepared to leave the hospital, the security officer approached holding a small envelope found near the waiting area. This was dropped before you arrived, he said. It has your name on it. Caleb turned it over slowly. The handwriting was old and familiar. It was not Richard's. It belonged to someone who had been gone for years. On the front were 3 words that made Caleb stop breathing for a moment. For Caleb Brooks. The envelope with Caleb Brooks' name on it was not a letter. It was a copy of a document that changed the entire situation before anyone had a chance to understand it. Inside were 3 pages of handwritten notes, a photograph of Richard Whitmore standing beside a much younger Caleb, and a signed statement dated 2 years earlier. Caleb read the first sentence twice because he could not believe what he was seeing. Richard had not simply trusted him. He had been preparing for this moment long before anyone knew there would be a fight over Naomi. But the final line created a new problem. Richard had written that the person protecting Naomi could not be someone who wanted control over her life. It had to be someone willing to walk away from everything if that was what kept her safe. Caleb folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope. Then he made the decision that shocked even Naomi. He called the hospital attorney and told him he would not seek temporary guardianship. The room became quiet. Everyone expected Caleb to fight for the position Richard had trusted him with. Instead, he stepped away from it. If Naomi needs someone who benefits from having power over her, I am not that person, he said. If she needs someone who will stand beside her, I will do that. The statement spread through the hospital faster than Caleb expected. Some people saw it as proof that he was sincere. Others saw it differently. Grant Whitmore used the moment immediately. By morning, rumors had reached the local news that Caleb had manipulated Richard into naming him as a protector, then abandoned the responsibility when legal questions became difficult. The story changed before Caleb could even respond. A man who owned almost nothing was suddenly being accused of wanting something he never asked for. The next surprise came from an unexpected person. Naomi's school counselor, Evelyn Harper, arrived at the hospital carrying a small file folder. She had known Naomi for 4 years and had noticed something unusual after Richard's health began declining. Your name appeared in her school records, Evelyn told Caleb. Not as a guardian, not as a relative, but as the person Richard wanted. Contacted if Naomi ever felt she had nowhere else to go. Caleb looked confused. Why would he do that? Evelyn opened the folder and removed a handwritten note from Richard. It was not addressed to Caleb. It was addressed to Naomi. But the final sentence made Caleb realize Richard had been preparing for a possibility nobody else considered. The person who helps you most may be the person who expects the least from you. Before anyone could process those words, another problem arrived. The hospital received an official request from the court ordering Naomi to remain under temporary supervision until the estate investigation was complete. Grant had filed an emergency petition claiming Caleb was an unverified outsider with no legal connection to the family. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Caleb looked at the papers, then at Naomi, who was holding Richard's old photograph in both hands. For the first time, she asked him a question he was not prepared to answer. If you are not my guardian, why did my father trust you with the one thing he was most afraid of losing? Caleb had no answer. Not yet. But before he could speak, Evelyn's phone rang. Her face changed as she listened. When the call ended, she looked directly at Caleb and whispered the words that made the entire case turn in a direction nobody expected. The court just received a new witness statement. Someone from Richard's past says you are not who they think you are. The courtroom hallway was already crowded before Caleb Brooks arrived, but the atmosphere changed the moment he walked through the doors. Reporters who had only heard rumors looked at him with curiosity. Some expected a wealthy advisor. Others expected a hidden businessman fighting for control. Instead, they saw a man wearing a simple jacket, carrying a worn canvas bag, and quietly asking Naomi if she had eaten breakfast. That small question confused everyone watching. Why would someone accused of chasing power care more about a teenager having a meal than defending himself? Inside the courtroom, the new witness statement waited on the judge's desk. Nobody knew who had written it. Nobody knew why Richard Whitmore had kept it hidden for so long. Grant Whitmore arrived confident, surrounded by attorneys who carried thick folders and carefully prepared arguments. He repeated the same claim he had made since the beginning. Caleb was an outsider. Caleb had no legal connection. Caleb had no reason to be trusted. Then the judge asked for the witness statement to be read aloud. The first surprise came when everyone learned the writer was not a stranger. It was Thomas Reed, the former manager of the Whitmore farm who had worked there for 30 years. Thomas described a day 3 years earlier when Richard's health had first started becoming difficult to manage. He wrote that Caleb had found Richard sitting alone after a long day, struggling with repairs that needed attention around the property. Caleb had fixed the problem, refused payment, and left before Richard could even properly thank him. But that was not the important part. The important part was what happened afterward. Thomas revealed that Richard had secretly watched Caleb for months, not because he suspected him, but because he was searching for something rare, someone who would help even when nobody was watching. The courtroom became quieter, but then Grant smiled. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something that made them both look relieved. When the judge continued reading, another detail appeared. Richard had once offered Caleb a position managing parts of the Whitmore estate, a position that would have provided a large salary and a permanent place within the family business. Caleb had declined. That changed the way people saw him, but it also created a new question. Why would a man with almost nothing refuse an opportunity that could completely change his life? Naomi looked at Caleb, waiting for an answer she had never heard before. Caleb lowered his eyes and remembered the conversation he had with Richard on that day. He had told him that accepting a job because of gratitude would turn their friendship into an obligation. He wanted to help because it was right, not because it benefited him. For the first time, even Grant looked uncertain. But the biggest revelation had not arrived yet. Thomas's statement contained one final page sealed separately from the others. The judge opened it slowly. The handwriting was Richard's. It explained that the witness statement was only the beginning. Richard had hidden a second piece of evidence because he feared the wrong person would discover it first. Everyone waited as the judge looked at the final page. Then her expression changed. She looked directly at Caleb and asked a question that made the entire room freeze. Mr. Brooks, why did Richard Whitmore write that you were the only person who knew the truth about his daughter? The courtroom went silent after the judge asked why Richard Whitmore believed Caleb Brooks knew the truth about Naomi. Every person in the room looked toward Caleb, expecting an explanation, but Caleb did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his worn canvas bag and removed a small wooden box. It was scratched, faded, and clearly old enough that nobody understood why it mattered. He placed it on the table in front of the judge. Richard gave this to me 3 years ago, Caleb said. He told me never to open it unless Naomi needed to know who she really was. The reaction was immediate. Naomi looked confused. Grant leaned forward for the first time without confidence. Even his attorneys exchanged uncertain glances. The judge asked why Caleb had kept something connected to Naomi hidden for years. Caleb looked toward the teenager and answered quietly. Because Richard asked me to protect her childhood, not just her future. The wooden box was opened carefully. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small notebook filled with Richard's handwriting. But the first letter was not addressed to Caleb. It was addressed to Naomi. The courtroom watched as the judge read the first few lines. Richard explained that years earlier, Naomi had discovered she was not only his daughter by adoption, but the last remaining connection to a family history filled with complicated decisions. He feared that one day people would try to define her by money instead of who she was becoming. That was why he searched for someone who understood one important thing. A person could inherit property without earning trust, but trust had to be built when nobody was watching. Suddenly, the strange details from years before carried new meaning. The reason Caleb always refused expensive gifts. The reason he never asked questions about Richard's finances. The reason he stayed away from business meetings even when invited. He was not uninterested. He was protecting a promise. But the next document changed everything. It revealed that Richard had not only trusted Caleb with Naomi's emotional safety. He had named Caleb as the person responsible for delivering a message that could decide the future of the Whitmore estate. Grant immediately objected. He argued that Caleb was still not family and had no legal standing. The judge agreed that trust alone was not enough. Evidence mattered. Then Naomi noticed something in the notebook that everyone else missed. A page had been removed from the middle. Someone had taken the most important part. The discovery shifted the entire room again. If Richard had prepared these documents carefully, why was one page missing? Who removed it? And what did it contain? Before anyone could answer, the courtroom doors opened. A woman in her 70s stepped inside, carrying a sealed folder. The judge recognized her name and immediately asked her to approach. Caleb looked at the woman, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his calm expression changed. He knew her. She was the one person Richard never wanted Naomi to meet until the right moment. The woman placed the folder on the judge's desk and whispered, "Richard was afraid this day would come. He told me that if Caleb ever had to prove himself, I needed to reveal why he chose him." She opened the folder halfway, then stopped. Inside was a document with a signature that made everyone in the courtroom realize the final decision would not be about inheritance at all. It would be about whether Caleb was willing to sacrifice the one thing Richard had secretly promised him. The folder on the judge's desk contained the final piece of Richard Whitmore's plan, but nobody in the courtroom expected what it revealed. The elderly woman who carried it forward introduced herself as Clara Whitmore, Richard's older sister. Grant immediately stepped back. For years, he had told everyone Clara lived too far away to be involved in family decisions. Yet she stood there holding the one document that could change everything. The judge opened the folder and found a signed agreement written 18 months earlier. It was not a transfer of wealth. It was a declaration of responsibility. Richard had created a private trust designed to protect Naomi's future, but the trust had one condition. The person overseeing it could never be someone seeking control, recognition, or financial benefit. The room became quiet as the judge read the final requirement. The chosen protector had to voluntarily refuse ownership of the trust assets before being considered. Everyone looked toward Caleb. Suddenly, his decision to reject every financial offer from Richard was no longer seen as hesitation. It was proof that he had already passed the test. Grant's confidence began to disappear, but he was not finished. He argued that Caleb had still hidden information from Naomi and the court. He knew about these documents, Grant said. He kept secrets from her. The accusation changed the atmosphere instantly. Naomi looked at Caleb, not with anger, but with a painful question in her eyes. Why had he carried this burden alone? Caleb took a slow breath before answering. "Because your father asked me to wait until you were ready to hear it from him, not from people fighting over what he left behind." That answer did not solve everything. It created a new question. What exactly had Richard been protecting Naomi from? Clara then revealed another part of the story. Years earlier, Richard discovered that certain relatives were quietly pressuring Naomi to choose between two identities. They wanted her to see herself as the future owner of a fortune instead of a young woman building her own life. Richard feared that money would become the loudest voice around her. That was why he chose Caleb. Not because Caleb had power, because he understood restraint. The people who once doubted Caleb began facing their own choices. The relatives who questioned his intentions avoided eye contact. The attorneys who assumed he wanted influence reviewed every document again. Even Grant had to confront the fact that his strongest argument had become the evidence against him. But the biggest consequence belonged to Naomi. For the first time, she realized that Richard's silence had not been rejection. It had been protection. She held the old photograph of herself beside the chestnut horse and noticed something written on the back. It was a message from Richard. 3 words. Choose your heart. Tears filled her eyes. But before the moment could settle, Clara reached into the folder and removed one final envelope. She looked at Caleb before handing it to the judge. "Richard told me this should only be opened after everyone learned the truth about why he trusted Caleb." The judge examined the envelope carefully. Then she noticed the signature. It was not Richard's. It was Caleb's. The courtroom froze. Caleb stared at the document, confused, because he had never signed anything connected to the Whitmore family. The judge looked up slowly and asked the question nobody expected. "Mr. Brooks, why is your signature on a promise you claim you never made?" The courtroom remained silent as the judge held the document with Caleb Brooks' signature in her hands. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Caleb finally stepped closer, not because he was afraid, but because he needed to understand something that had been hidden from him as well. The judge turned the page toward him. At the bottom was a promise written years earlier. It was a statement Richard had asked Caleb to sign after a conversation neither of them ever shared with anyone else. The promise was simple. If Richard was ever unable to protect Naomi himself, Caleb would make sure she was never forced to choose between love and security. Caleb remembered that day clearly. Richard had not offered him money. He had not offered him a position. He had asked him one question. If nobody ever thanked you, would you still do what was right? Caleb had answered yes. That was the promise. Not ownership. Not authority. A commitment. The judge looked across the courtroom and explained that the document did not give Caleb control over Naomi's life. It proved something much more important. Richard had chosen someone who would never confuse responsibility with possession. The meaning of every earlier moment changed. The envelope, the key, the refusal of money, the decision to step away from guardianship. None of those actions came from a man trying to gain something. They came from a man willing to lose something. Naomi lowered her eyes, holding back tears as she looked at Caleb. She finally understood why her father had trusted him. Not because he was powerful, because he was safe. But there was still one final obstacle. Grant's attorneys argued that emotional trust could not replace legal responsibility. They demanded proof that Caleb could provide Naomi with stability beyond kindness. The question was no longer whether Caleb had a good heart. It was whether his life reflected the values Richard believed in. Then the unexpected evidence arrived. Evelyn Harper, Naomi's school counselor, presented years of records showing that Caleb had quietly supported Naomi's education without ever asking Richard for recognition. He had paid for school supplies anonymously when he noticed she needed them. He had repaired her old bicycle before a school event. He had attended meetings when Richard was too sick to go, but always remained outside unless Naomi asked him to enter. He had spent years helping while making sure Naomi knew her father was the person she should thank. The room changed. The people who once questioned Caleb's motives began seeing the pattern they had ignored. Even Grant had no answer when the judge asked a simple question. Can anyone here provide evidence that Mr. Brooks acted for personal gain? Nobody spoke. The judge approved Richard's trust arrangement and confirmed that Naomi would remain surrounded by the people her father personally selected. But the most important moment came afterward, outside the courtroom. Naomi found Caleb standing alone near a window, looking at the old photograph Richard had left behind. She walked toward him slowly and held out the brass key. My father trusted you with this because he knew something I did not. Caleb looked at her. What was that? Naomi smiled sadly. That family is not always the people who share your name. Caleb accepted the key, but before he could answer, Naomi noticed something engraved on the back that neither of them had seen before. A date and a name. A name that connected Richard's past to Caleb's life in a way neither of them expected. 6 months after the courtroom decision, the Whitmore farm looked different, but not because of money. The old wooden fences still needed repairs. The same gravel road still curved past the fields. The same chestnut horse still waited near the barn every morning. But something inside the house had changed. The silence that once filled the rooms after Richard Whitmore became ill had been replaced by ordinary sounds again. Laughter from the kitchen, footsteps running down the hallway, conversations that did not need to be careful anymore. Caleb Brooks never moved into the Whitmore estate. That surprised many people. The trust could have provided him with comfort, a larger home, and a life far easier than the one he had built for himself. Instead, he kept his small apartment across town and continued working at the local museum. When people asked why, he always gave the same answer. Richard did not trust me because I needed a better life. He trusted me because I was willing to protect someone else's. Naomi remembered those words. She carried them with her as she prepared for her first year of college. The girl who once stood quietly in hospital hallways wondering who she could trust had become someone who understood her own value. She still kept Richard's photograph beside her desk, but now another object sat beside it. The old brass key. The same key Richard had placed in Caleb's hand on that unforgettable afternoon. Except now, Naomi knew what it truly represented. It was never about a locked room. It was about a door someone chose to open for another person. One evening, while organizing old family records, Naomi discovered the meaning behind the name engraved on the back of the key. It belonged to Caleb's father, a man Richard had known decades earlier through a small community project. Richard had once been helped by Caleb's father during a difficult moment in his own youth, and years later, when he met Caleb, he recognized the same quiet character he had admired long ago. The connection was not about debt. It was about a promise passed from one generation to another. Richard had not chosen Caleb because of his background, his job, or what he could provide. He chose him because kindness had a memory. People often remembered the biggest moments in life, but Richard had built his decision on the smallest ones. A repaired fence, a returned favor, a forgotten kindness done without an audience. 1 year after Richard's passing, the Whitmore family gathered at the farm for a simple dinner. No reporters came. No lawyers stood nearby. There were no arguments about inheritance. Just people sharing a meal. Grant attended quietly. He never apologized with dramatic speeches, but he changed. He began volunteering with the same community program Richard once supported, perhaps finally understanding that the things worth keeping were never the things he could own. Before dinner ended, Naomi placed the brass key in Caleb's hand. He immediately tried to return it. She smiled and closed his fingers around it. "My father was right," she said. "You always try to give back everything you received." Caleb looked at the key and remembered the day Richard first gave it to him. Back then, everyone saw an ordinary man holding something valuable. They did not understand that the value was never in what the key opened. It was in the trust behind it. Caleb looked around the table, at the people who had once questioned him and the young woman who now called him family. And for the first time, he understood that having almost nothing had never meant having nothing at all. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.